From Mauss to Claude Lévi-Strauss. What we now call social anthropology, to use a term which is customary outside France and is spreading in France, is what sociology becomes when it admits that the social, like man himself, has two poles or facets. It is significant, capable of being understood from within, and at the same time personal intentions within it are generalized, toned down, and tend toward processes, being, as the famous expression has it, mediated by things. Now, no one in France has anticipated this more supple sociology as Marcel Mauss has. In many respects, social anthropology consists of Mauss's works, which are still vital in our time. After 25 years, the famous Essai sur le don, Forme archaïque de l'échange, has just been translated for Anglo-Saxon readers with a preface by Evans-Pritchard. Few people, Claude Lévi-Strauss writes, have been able to read Essai sur le don without having the still indefinable yet imperious certainty of being present at a decisive event in the development of science. A stage in the development of sociology which has made such impressions is worth reconsidering. The new science had wanted, in Durkheim's well-known phrase, to treat social facts as things and no longer as objectified systems of ideas. But as soon as it tried to be more precise, it only succeeded in defining the social as pertaining to the psychical. Social facts, it was said, were representations. It was just that instead of being individual, they were collective. From this was derived the much-discussed idea of collective consciousness, conceived of as a distinct entity at the heart of history. The relation between it and the individual, like that between two things, remained external. What was given to sociological explanation was taken away from psychological and physiological explanation, and vice versa. In another connection, under the name of social morphology, Durkheim proposed an ideal genesis of societies through the combination of elementary societies and the composition of compounds among them. The simple was confused with the essential and the primitive. Lévy-Bruhl's idea of a pre-logical mentality went no further towards opening our eyes to all there can be in so-called primitive cultures, which is irreducible to our own, since it congealed them in an insurmountable difference. In both ways, the French school missed that access to another person which nonetheless defines sociology. How can we understand someone else without sacrificing him to our logic or it to him? Whether it assimilated reality too quickly to our own ideas, or on the contrary declared it impenetrable to them, sociology always spoke as if it could roam over the object of its investigations at will. The sociologist was an absolute observer. What was lacking was a patient penetration of its object, communication with it. Marcel Mauss, on the contrary, met these lacks instinctively. Neither his teachings nor his works are a polemic against the principles of the French school. As Durkheim's nephew and collaborator, he had every reason to do him justice. It is in his particular way of making contact with the social that the difference between them bursts forth. In the study of magic, Mauss said, concomitant variations and external correlations leave a residue, which must be described, for it is in this residue that the underlying reasons for belief are found. Consequently, we have to think our way into the phenomenon, reading or deciphering it. And this reading always consists in grasping the mode of exchange which is constituted between men through institutions, through the connections and equivalences they establish, and through the systematic way in which they govern the use of tools, manufactured or alimentary products, magical formulas, ornaments, chants, dances, and mythical elements, as a given language governs the use of phonemes, morphemes, vocabulary, and syntax. This social fact, which is no longer a massive reality, but an efficacious system of symbols or a network of symbolic values, is going to be inserted into the depths of the individual. But the regulation which circumvents the individual does not eliminate him. It is no longer necessary to choose between the individual and the collective. What is true, Mauss writes, is not a prayer or law, but the Melanesian on such and such an island, Rome or Athens. Similarly, there are no longer just absolutes or mere summations, but everywhere totalities or articulated wholes of varying richness. Mauss notices contrasts in the supposed syncretism of primitive mentality, which are just as important for him as the famous participations. In conceiving of the social as a symbolism, he had provided himself with the means for respecting individual and social reality and cultural variety without making one impervious to the other. A more comprehensive way of thinking ought to be able to penetrate to the irrational in magic and the gift. Above all, he said, we must make up the largest possible list of categories. We must set out from all those we can know that men have made use of. Then we shall see that there are still many dead or pale or darkened moons in the firmament of reason. But for Mauss, this was more of an insight concerning the social than a theory about it. Perhaps that is why his conclusions fall short of his discovery. He looks for the principle of exchange in manner, as he had looked for that of magic in how. These are enigmatic concepts which do not so much provide a theory about the facts as reproduce the society's own theory. In reality, they only designate a sort of emotional cement between the multitudinous facts which he had to link together. But are these facts distinct to begin with, so that we must try to bring them together? Isn't the synthesis primary? Isn't manner precisely the obvious fact for the individual that there are certain relationships of equivalence between what he gives, receives, and gives back again? Isn't it his experience of a certain distance between himself and his institutional state of equilibrium with others, the primary fact of his behavior's double reference to himself and the other person, and the demands of an invisible totality, which in his eyes both he and the other person are substitutable parts of? If so, the exchange would not be an effect of society, but society itself in act. What there is of the numinous in manner would stem from the essence of symbolism, and would become accessible to us through the paradoxes of speech and our relation to others. It would be analogous to that zero phoneme the linguists talk about, which, without having any assignable value itself, is contrasted to the absence of phonemes, or to that floating signifier which articulates nothing yet opens a field of possible signification. But in speaking in this way, we are following the movement of Mauss's thought beyond what he said and wrote. We are looking at him retrospectively in the perspective of social anthropology. We have already crossed the line which separates his thought from a different conception of and approach to the social, a conception which is brilliantly represented by Claude Lévi-Strauss. In this new approach, the way in which exchange is organized in a sector of society, or in society as a whole, is called structure. Social facts are neither things nor ideas, they are structures. Overused today, the term had a precise meaning to begin with. Psychologists used it to designate the configurations of the perceptual field, those wholes articulated by certain lines of force and giving every phenomenon its local value. In linguistics, too, structure is a concrete, incarnate system. When Saussure used to say that linguistic signs are diacritical, that they function only through their differences, through a certain spread between themselves and other signs, and not, to begin with, by evoking a positive signification, he was making us see the unity which lies beneath a language's explicit signification, a systematization which is achieved in a language before its conceptual principle is known. For social anthropology, society is composed of systems of this type, systems of kinship and direct consanguinity, with the appropriate marriage regulations, systems of art, myth, and ritual. Social anthropology is itself the interacting totality of these systems. In saying that all these are structures, we distinguish them from the old social philosophy's crystallized ideas. The subjects living in a society do not necessarily know about the principle of exchange which governs them, any more than the speaking subject needs to go through a linguistic analysis of his language in order to speak. They ordinarily make use of the structure as a matter of course. Rather than their having got it, it has, if we may put it this way, got them. Suppose we compare it to language, either in the everyday or the poetic usage of speech, where words seem to speak by themselves and become entities. Structure, like Janus, has two faces. On one side, it organizes its constituent parts according to an internal principle. It is meaning. But this meaning it bears is, so to speak, a clumsy meaning. Thus, when the scientist formulates and conceptually determines structures and constructs models by means of which he intends to understand existing societies, there is no question for him of substituting the model for reality. As a matter of principle, structure is no Platonic idea. To imagine imperishable archetypes which dominate the life of all possible societies would be to make the mistake the old linguistics made when it supposed that there was a natural affinity for a given meaning in certain sonorous material. It would be to forget that the same traits of physiognomy can have a different meaning in different societies, according to the system they are caught up in. The reason why contemporary American society has rediscovered a path in its mythology, which has already been taken in another time or place, is not that a transcendent archetype has been embodied 3 times in Roman Saturnalia, Mexican Cachinas, and the American Christmas. It is that this mythical structure offers a way of resolving some local, present tension, and is recreated in the dynamics of the present. Structure does not deprive society of any of its weight or thickness. Society itself is a structure of structures. How could there be absolutely no relationship between the linguistic system, the economic system, and the kinship system it employs? But this relationship is subtle and variable. Sometimes it is a homology. At other times, as in the case of myth and ritual, one structure is the counterpart and antagonist of the other. Society as structure remains a many-faceted reality amenable to more than one interpretation. Up to what point can the comparison go? Will we end up finding, as sociology, in the correct sense of the term would have it, universal invariance? That remains to be seen. Nothing limits structural research in this direction, but neither does anything require it to postulate the existence of such invariance at the outset. The primary concern of such research is to substitute relationships of complementarity for antinomies wherever it can. Thus, it is going to spread out in all directions, toward the universal and toward the monograph, each time going as far as possible to test just what may be lacking in each of the interpretations taken singly. The search for the elementary in kinship systems is going to be directed through the variety of customs toward a structural schema they can be considered variants of. From the moment that consanguinity excludes union, that the man gives up taking a wife in his biological family or his group and must go outside to form a union which requires, for reasons of equilibrium, an immediate or a mediate counterpart, a phenomenon of exchange begins, which may be complicated indefinitely when direct reciprocity gives way to a general form of exchange. Thus models must be constructed which bring out the different possible constellations and the internal arrangement of different types of preferential marriage and different kinship systems. Our ordinary mental equipment is inadequate to reveal these extremely complex multidimensional structures, and perhaps we shall have recourse to a quasi-mathematical form of expression which we shall be all the more able to make use of now that mathematics is no longer limited to quantitative relationships and what is measurable. One can even dream of a periodic table of kinship structures comparable to Mendeleev's periodic table of chemical elements. It is sound practice to envision at the limit the program of a universal code of structures, which would allow us to deduce them from one another by means of rules of transformation, and to construct possible systems different from existing ones, if it were only to direct empirical observation, as it has already been directed, towards certain existing institutions which would remain unnoticed without this theoretical anticipation. There thus appears at the base of social systems a formal infrastructure. One is tempted to say an unconscious thought, an anticipation of the human mind, as if our science were already completed in events, and the human order of culture a second order of nature dominated by other invariants. But even if these invariants exist, even if social science were to find beneath structures a metastructure to which they conformed, as phonology does beneath phonemes, the universal we would thus arrive at could no more be substituted for the particular than general geometry annuls the local truth of Euclidean spatial relations. In sociology, too, there are considerations of scale, and the truth of general sociology in no way detracts from that of microsociology. The implications of a formal structure may well bring out the internal necessity of a given genetic sequence, but it is not these implications which make men, society, and history exist. A formal portrait of societies, or even general articulations of every society, do not constitute a metaphysics. The ideal models or diagrams, traced out by a purely objective method, are instruments of understanding. The elementary, which social anthropology seeks, is still elementary structures. That is, the connecting links of a thought network, which leads us back from itself to the other face of the structure and to its own incarnation. The surprising logical operations attested to by the formal structure of societies must certainly be effected in some way by the populations which live these kinship systems. Thus, there ought to be a sort of lived equivalent of that structure, which the anthropologist must look for, this time through work which is no longer simply mental, at the price of his comfort and even his security. This process of joining objective analysis to lived experience is perhaps the most proper task of anthropology, the one which distinguishes it from other social science, such as economics and demography. Value, yield, productivity, and maximum population are objects of a type of thinking which encompasses the social. We cannot require them to appear in the individual's experience in a pure state. The variables of anthropology, on the contrary, must be met with sooner or later on the level at which phenomena have an immediately human significance. What disturbs us in this method of convergence is the old prejudice which opposes induction to deduction, as if the example of Galileo did not already show that actual thinking moves back and forth between experience and intellectual construction or reconstruction. Now experience in anthropology is our insertion as social subjects into a whole in which the synthesis our intelligence laboriously looks for has already been effected, since we live in the unity of one single life, all the systems our culture is composed of. We can gain some knowledge from this synthesis which is ourselves. Furthermore, the equipment of our social being can be dismantled and reconstructed by the voyage, as we are able to learn to speak other languages. This provides a second way to the universal, no longer the overarching universal of a strictly objective method, but a sort of lateral universal which we acquire through ethnological experience and the incessant testing of the self through the other person and the other person through the self. It is a question of constructing a general system of reference in which the point of view of the native, the point of view of the civilized man, and the mistaken views each has of the other can all find a place. That is, of constituting a more comprehensive experience which becomes, in principle, accessible to men of a different time and country. Ethnology is not a speciality defined by a particular object, primitive societies. It is a way of thinking, the way which imposes itself when the object is different, and requires us to transform ourselves. We also become the ethnologists of our own society if we set ourselves at a distance from it. For a few dozen years, since American society has become less sure of itself, it has given ethnologists access to governmental and military agencies. This is a remarkable method, which consists in learning to see what is ours as alien, and what was alien as our own. And not even this expatriate eye of ours can be trusted. The will to go abroad itself has its personal motives, which may distort the evidence. Thus, we shall have to say what these motives are too, precisely because we want to be true. Not because ethnology is literature, but because, on the contrary, its uncertainty ends only if the man who speaks of man does not wear a mask himself. At the point where two cultures cross, truth and error dwell together, either because our own training hides what there is to know from us, or on the contrary, because it becomes, in our life in the field, a means of incorporating other people's differences. When Frazer used to say of fieldwork, "God save me from it," he was depriving himself not only of facts, but of a mode of understanding. Of course, it is neither possible nor necessary for the same man to have experiential knowledge of all the societies he speaks about. He only has to have learned at some time, and at sufficient length, to let himself be taught by another culture. for from then on he has a new organ of understanding at his disposal. He has regained possession of that untamed region of himself, unincorporated in his own culture, through which he communicates with other cultures. Then, even at his desk and from a distance, he can cross-check the correlations of the most objective analysis with genuine perception. Take, for example, knowledge of the structures of myth. We know how disappointing the attempts at general mythology have been. Perhaps they would have been less so if we had learned to listen to myths as we listen to an informant's account in the field, that is, to its tone, its style, its rhythm, and its recurrent themes no less than to its manifest content. To want to understand myth as a proposition in terms of what it says is to apply our own grammar and vocabulary to a foreign language. Then the whole myth has to be decoded without our even being able to postulate, as cryptographers do, that the code we are looking for has the same structure as ours. Leaving aside what myth tells us at first sight, which would tend to divert us from its true meaning, let us study its inner articulation, taking its episodes only insofar as they have what Saussure calls a diacritical value and produce such and such a recurrent relation or contrast. As an illustration of the method and not as a theory, let us say, for example, that the difficulty of walking straight reappears 3 times in the Oedipus myth, the murder of a Chthonian creature twice. These elements would be confirmed by 2 other contrasting systems. We would be surprised to find comparable elements in North American mythology, and through cross-checkings, which cannot be reproduced here, we would arrive at the hypothesis that the structure of the Oedipus myth expresses the conflict between belief in human autochthony and overvaluation of kinship relations. From this point of view, we can classify the myth's known variants, derive one from another by rules of transformation, and see them as so many logical tools and modes of mediation serving to arbitrate a fundamental contradiction. We have listened in on myth, and we end up at a logical, or as we could say with equal justification, an ontological diagram. Such and such a myth of the Canadian Pacific coast presupposes, in the last analysis, that the existent appears to the native as the negation of the non-existent. What is common to these abstract formulations and the quasi-ethnological method we adopted at the outset is a guiding thread of structure, experienced first in its compulsive repetitions and finally grasped in its exact form. Here, anthropology comes into contact with psychology. The Freudian version of the Oedipus myth becomes a particular case of its structural version. Man's relationship to the earth is not present in it, but what produces the Oedipal crisis is certainly, in Freud's view, the duality of sires, the paradox of the human kinship order. The Freudian hermeneutics, too, in its least disputable aspect, is certainly the deciphering of an aneric and reticent language, the language of our conduct. Neurosis is an individual myth, and like it, myth is clarified when we look at it as a series of stratifications or laminations, or, to put it differently, as a spiral thinking, which is always trying to hide its fundamental contradiction from itself. But anthropology gives the acquisitions of psychoanalysis or psychology new depth by incorporating them in its own framework. Freud, or today's psychologists, are not absolute observers. They belong to the history of Western thought. Thus, we must not think that Westerners' neuroses and complexes give us a clear view of the truth of myth, magic, or witchcraft. According to the ethnological method's rule of reciprocal criticism, we must be equally concerned with seeing psychoanalysis as myth, and the psychoanalyst as a witch doctor or shaman. Our psychosomatic investigations enable us to understand how the shaman heals, how, for example, he helps in a difficult delivery. But the shaman also enables us to understand that psychoanalysis is our own witchcraft. Even in its most canonical and respectable forms, psychoanalysis reaches the truth about a life only through the rapport it establishes between 2 lives in the solemn atmosphere of transference, which is not a purely objective method, if such a method exists. When it is applied to so-called normal subjects themselves, with all the more reason, it ceases completely to be a conception which can be discussed or justified by cases. It no longer heals, it persuades. Psychoanalysis itself fashions subjects who conform to its interpretation of man. It has its converts, and perhaps its defectors. It can no longer have its convinced adherents, for it is neither true nor false, but a myth. When Freudianism has deteriorated to this degree, it is no longer an interpretation of the Oedipus myth, but one of its variants. On a deeper level, anthropology's concern is neither to prove that the primitive is wrong, nor to side with him against us, but to set itself up on a ground where we shall both be intelligible without any reduction or rash transposition. This is what we do when we take the symbolic function as the source of all reason and unreason. For the number and richness of significations man has at his disposal always exceed the circle of definite objects which warrant the name signified, because the symbolic function must always be ahead of its object, and finds reality only by anticipating it in imagination. Thus, our task is to broaden our reasoning to make it capable of grasping what, in ourselves and in others, precedes and exceeds reason. This attempt rejoins that of the other semiological sciences, and in general of the other sciences. Niels Bohr wrote, "The traditional differences between human cultures in many respects resemble the different and equivalent ways in which physical experience may be described. Today, each traditional category calls for a complementary, that is, an incompatible and inseparable view, and it is under these difficult conditions that we are looking for what makes up the framework of the world. Linguistic time is no longer that series of simultaneities familiar to classical thought, which Saussure was still thinking of when he set the perspectives of the simultaneous and the successive apart as two clearly distinct realms. In Troubetzkoy's linguistics, synchronics, like legendary or mythological time, encroaches upon succession and diachronics. If the symbolic function outstrips what is given, there is inevitably something confused in the whole order of the culture it sustains. The antithesis between nature and culture is no longer sharp and clear. Anthropology comes back to an important class of cultural facts which are not governed by the rule prohibiting incest. Indian endogamy and the Iranian or Egyptian or Arabian practice of consanguineous or collateral marriage attest to the fact that culture sometimes comes to terms with nature. Now, the forms of culture involved here are just the ones which have made scientific knowledge and a cumulative and progressive social life possible. It would seem that in its most efficacious, if not its most beautiful forms, culture is more of a transformation of nature, a series of mediations in which the structure never emerges at the outset as a pure universal. What, except history, can we call this milieu in which a form laden with contingency suddenly opens a cycle of future and commands it with the authority of an established institution? Of course, this history is not the one which seeks to make up the whole human field from instantaneous decisions and events situated and dated in serial time, but that history which is well aware that myth and legendary time always haunt human enterprises in other forms, which looks on the near or far side of minutely divided events, and which is in fact called structural history. This notion of structure, whose present good fortune in all domains responds to an intellectual need, establishes a whole system of thought. For the philosopher, the presence of structure outside us in natural and social systems, and within us as symbolic function, points to a way beyond the subject-object correlation which has dominated philosophy from Descartes to Hegel. By showing us that man is eccentric to himself, and that the social finds its center only in man, structure particularly enables us to understand how we are in a sort of circuit with the socio-historical world. But this is too much philosophizing, whose weight anthropology does not have to bear. What interests the philosopher in anthropology is just that it takes man as he is, in his actual situation of life and understanding. The philosopher it interests is not the one who wants to explain or construct the world, but the one who seeks to deepen our insertion in being. Thus his recommendation could not possibly endanger anthropology, since it is based upon what is most concrete in anthropological method. The present works of Lévi-Strauss, and those in preparation, clearly proceed from the same inspiration. But at the same time his research is renewing itself, surging forward on the basis of its own acquisitions. He is in the field, planning to gather documentation in Melanesia, which would enable him to move on in theory to the complex kinship structures, that is, those structures from which our matrimonial system in particular arises. Now, it already seems to him that this will not be simply an extension of previous works, but will, on the contrary, give them an added significance. In his initial view, modern kinship systems, which leave the determination of husband and wife to demographic, economic, or psychological conditioning, had to be defined as more complex variants of exchange. But full knowledge of complex exchange has not left the meaning of the central phenomenon of exchange intact. It has required and made possible a decisive deepening of it. Claude Lévi-Strauss does not plan to compare the complex systems deductively and dogmatically with simple ones. On the contrary, he thinks that the historical approach, across the Middle Ages and Indo-European and Semitic institutions, is indispensable to our understanding of these complex systems, and that historical analysis will require a distinction between a culture which absolutely prohibits incest, and is the simple, direct, or immediate negation of nature, and a different culture which is the source of contemporary kinship systems, and tends to scheme with nature and sometimes get around the prohibition of incest. It is precisely this second type of culture which has shown itself capable of opening a hand-to-hand struggle with nature and creating science, man's technical domination, and what has been called cumulative history. Thus, from the viewpoint of modern kinship systems and historical societies, exchange, as direct or immediate negation of nature, would seem to be the limiting case of a more general relationship of otherness. It is only at this level that the final significance of Lévi-Strauss's first investigations and the underlying nature of exchange and the symbolic function will be definitively established. At the level of elementary structures, the laws of exchange, which completely envelop behavior, are susceptible to a static study. And man, without even always formulating them in an indigenous theory, obeys them almost as the atom follows the law of distribution which defines it. At the other end of the anthropological field, in certain complex systems, structures burst apart and, as far as the determination of husband and wife is concerned, become open to historical motivations. Here, exchange, symbolic function, and society no longer act as a second nature, which is as imperious as the other and effaces it. Each person is invited to define his own system of exchange. By this very process, the frontiers between cultures are erased. For the first time, no doubt, a world civilization becomes the order of the day. This complex human community's relationship to nature and life is neither simple nor clear. What animal psychology and ethnology unveil in animality is not, assuredly, the origin of humanity, but rough sketches, partial prefigurations, and something like anticipatory caricatures of it. Man and society are not exactly outside of nature and the biological. They distinguish themselves from them by bringing nature's stakes together and risking them all together. This upheaval means immense gains, wholly new possibilities, as it also means losses which we must be able to estimate, risks we are beginning to ascertain. Exchange and symbolic function lose their rigidity, but also their hieratic beauty. Mythology and ritual are replaced by reason and method, but also by a wholly profane practice of life, which is accompanied, moreover, by shallow little compensatory myths. It is in taking all this into consideration that social anthropology is wending its way toward a balanced account of the human spirit and toward a view of what it is and can be. Thus, inquiry feeds on facts which seem foreign to it at first, acquires new dimensions as it progresses, and reinterprets its first results in the light of new investigations which they have themselves inspired. At the same time, the scope of the domain covered and the precision of factual knowledge are increased. These are the marks of a great intellectual endeavor.